Rencontre avec Richard Ford. Richard Ford, vous êtes né en 1944 dans le Mississippi. Vous avez publié votre premier roman, Une mort secrète, en 1976. Vous êtes le père du célèbre héros Frank Bascombe, ex-journaliste sportif devenu agent immobilier. Vous avez reçu pour votre roman Indépendance à la fois le prix PEN Faulkner et le Pulitzer. Et je crois que c'est la seule fois que ça s'est produit. Depuis le retrait de Philip Roth de la littérature, vous êtes le boss de la littérature américaine. Même le parrain. C'est pas moi qui le dis, c'est Ian McEwan qui vous l'a dit quand Jacob Dyke est mort. Maintenant, c'est toi le patron. Il n'y a pas que lui, il y a Raymond Carver aussi. Si l'on considère l'œuvre de Richard Ford phrase après phrase, on tient là le meilleur styliste d'Amérique. C'est pas mal d'avoir le meilleur styliste d'Amérique ce soir. On est heureux, Richard Ford, que pour le festival, vous ayez quitté le Maine où vous vivez, à Paradise Point, dans une ancienne maison de pêcheurs de homards, devant l'océan, avec votre femme adorée, Christina. Vous êtes aujourd'hui Mellon Professor in the Humanities at Columbia University, New York City. Vous n'aviez pas publié de livre depuis 2008 et vous revenez avec Canada, où va s'exiler Dell, le héros de Canada. Alors je vais aller très vite. Ça a été beaucoup écrit. Canada commence dans une famille, celle que forme Bev Parsons, ancien de l'US Air Force, devenu escroc, et Niva Kemper, maîtresse d'école qui a perdu toutes ses illusions, et leurs deux enfants, deux jumeaux, Dell, le héros de Canada, et Burner, sa sœur. Il va y avoir un braquage, vous savez tous ça, un braquage raté organisé par les parents. Le fils part au Canada, la sœur prend un autre chemin. Et à la fin, comme l'a écrit Michel Schneider dans Le Point, il se retrouve ayant payé les dettes des parents, Berner par un cancer, Dell par un livre, seule lueur au bout du passé. C'est un livre où l'on vit, Canada, c'est un livre où l'on meurt, c'est un livre dont on tourne les pages avec envie et férocité à la fois, c'est un livre qui nous pose énormément de questions. Comment on survit à notre enfance? Comment on survit à nos parents? C'est un livre sur la frontière entre les États-Unis et le Canada. C'est un livre sur la frontière entre le bien et le mal, la souffrance et la guérison, l'innocence et la culpabilité, l'adolescence et l'âge adulte. Et c'est de toutes ces frontières que nous allons parler ce soir avec vous, Richard Ford. Et vous allez en plus nous offrir le grand plaisir de nous lire quelques pages de Canada. Mais je crois que vous vouliez dire un mot d'abord.
Lecteur. Merci bien pour venir ce soir et merci à mon ami et collègue Christophe pour ta générosité. Je suis honoré d'être ici et pour cette invitation. Le musée est... on est muet d'être ici, vraiment. Donc, il y avait cette semaine un article dans le Herald Tribune, et je suppose aussi dans le New York Times. Peut-être vous ne lisez pas ces journaux, et pourquoi devez-vous? Mais dans cet article, le journaliste a écrit que Paris a perdu son pouls, et donc que cette infusion des écrivains du monde peut peut-être l'aider à le retrouver.
On espère.
Cependant, moi, je ne crois pas que Paris a perdu son pouls. Loin de là. Et en fait, je suis sûr que mes collègues et moi-même sommes arrivés à Paris justement touchés et se sentir ce pouls. Et moi, ce pouls persiste toujours fortement, juste au cas où il y a une question de ça. Bon, je vais lire le début de ce roman Canada dans l'américaine. Il n'est pas long. Et je veux dire merci à mon grand ami Olivier Cohen et ses collègues à l'édition de l'Olivier et dire merci à Madame José Camoun qui a traduit ce livre en français. Et parlant des traductions, je suis désolé que la qualité de mon français est si pauvre. Peut-être mon américain sera mieux. I think if I take this out of my ear, I'll actually be a human being. First, I'll tell about the robbery our parents committed, then about the murders, which happened later. The robbery is the more important part, since it served to set my and my sister's lives and the courses they eventually followed. Nothing would make complete sense without that being told first. Our parents were the least likely two people in the world to rob a bank. They weren't strange people, not obviously criminals. No one would have thought they were destined to end up the way they did. They were just regular, although, of course, that kind of thinking became null and void the moment they did rob a bank. My father, Bev Parsons, was a country boy born in Marengo County, Alabama in 1923 and came out of high school in 1939, burning to be in the Army Air Corps, the branch that became the Air Force. He went in at Demopolis, trained at Randolph near San Antonio, longed to be a fighter pilot, but lacked the aptitude, and so learned bombardiering instead. He flew the B-25s, the light medium Mitchells, that were seeing duty in the Philippines and later over Osaka, where they rained destruction on the earth, both on the enemy and undeserving people alike. He was a tall, winning, smiling, handsome 6-footer. He barely fitted into his bombardier's compartment, with a big, square, expectant face and knobby cheekbones and sensuous lips and long, attractive feminine eyelashes. He had white, shiny teeth and short black hair he was proud of, as he was of his name, Bev, Captain Bev Parsons. He never conceded that Beverly was a woman's name in most people's minds. It grew from Anglo-Saxon roots, he said. It's a common name in England. Vivian and Gwen and Shirley are men's names there. No one confuses them with women. He was a non-stop talker, was open-minded for a Southerner, had graceful, obliging manners that should have taken him far in the Air Force, but didn't. His quick hazel eyes would search around any room he was in, finding someone to pay attention to, and my sister and me ordinarily. He told corny jokes in a Southern theatrical style, could do card tricks and magic tricks, could detach his thumb and replace it, make a handkerchief disappear and come back. He could play boogie-woogie piano and sometimes would talk Dixie to us, and sometimes like Amos and Andy. He had lost some of his hearing by flying the Mitchells. Nothing works here. Oh, boy. It's funny, I had it a moment ago. He had lost some of his hearing by flying the Mitchells and was sensitive about it. But he looked sharp in his honest GI haircut and blue captain's tunic and generally conveyed a warmth that was genuine and made my twin sister and me love him. He was also probably the reason my mother had been attracted to him, though they couldn't have been more unsuited and different, and unluckily gotten pregnant from their one hasty encounter after meeting at a party honoring returned airmen near where he was retraining to learn supply officer duties at Fort Lewis in March 1945, when no one needed him to drop bombs anymore. They were married immediately when they found out. Her parents lived in Tacoma and were Jewish immigrants from Poland and didn't approve. They were educated mathematics teachers and semi-professional musicians and popular concertizers in Poznan who'd escaped after 1918 and come to Washington State through Canada and became, of all things, school custodians. Being Jews meant little to them by then, or to our mother. Just an old, exacting, constricted conception of life they were happy to put behind them in a land where there apparently were no Jews. But for their only daughter to marry a smiling, talkative, only son of Scotch-Irish, Alabama backwoods timber estimators was never in their thinking, and they soon put it out of their thinking altogether. And while from a distance it may seem that our parents were merely not made for one another, it was more true that when our mother married our father, it betokened a loss, and her life changed forever, and not in a good way, as she surely must have believed. My mother, Neva Camper, short for Geneva, was a tiny, intense, bespectacled woman with unruly brown hair, downy vestiges of which ran down her jawline. She had thick eyebrows and a shiny, thin-skinned forehead under which her veins were visible, and a pale indoor complexion that made her appear fragile, which she wasn't. My father jokingly said that where he was from in Alabama, people called her hair Jew hair or immigrant hair, but he liked it and loved her. She never seemed to pay these words much attention. She had small, delicate hands whose nails she kept manicured and shined and was vain about and gestured with absently. She owned a skeptical frame of mind, was an intent listener when we talked to her, and had a wit that could turn biting. She wore frameless glasses, read French poetry, often used terms like cauchemar or trou de coul, which my sister and I didn't understand. She wrote poems in brown ink bought through the mail and kept a journal we weren't permitted to read, and normally had a slightly nose-elevated, astigmatized expression of perplexity, which became true of her and may always have been true. Before she married my father and quickly had my sister and me, she graduated at 18 from Whitman College in Walla Walla. Had worked in a bookstore, featured herself possibly as a bohemian and a poet, and had hoped someday to land a job as a studious small college instructor, married to someone different from who she did marry, conceivably a college professor, which would have given her the life she believed she was intended for. She was only 34 in 1960, the year these events occurred. But she already had serious lines beside her nose, which was small and pinkish at its tip, and her large, penetrating gray-green eyes had dusky lids that made her seem foreign and slightly sad and dissatisfied, which she was. She possessed a pretty thin neck and a sudden, unexpected smile that showed off her small teeth and girlish, heart-shaped mouth, though it was a smile she rarely practiced, except on my sister and me. We realized she was an unusual-looking person, dressed as she typically was in olive-color slacks and baggy sleeve cotton blouses and hempen cotton shoes she must have sent away to the West Coast for, since you couldn't buy such things in Great Falls. And she only seemed more unusual, standing reluctantly beside our tall, handsome, outgoing father. It was rarely the case that we went out as a family or ate in restaurants, so that we hardly noticed how they appeared in the world among strangers. To us, life in our house seemed normal. My sister and I could easily see why my mother would have been attracted to Bev Parsons, big, plank-shouldered, talkative, funny, forever waiting to please anybody who came in range. But it was never completely obvious why he would take an interest in her, tiny, barely 5 feet, inward and shy, alienated, artistic, pretty only when she smiled and witty only when she felt completely comfortable. He must have somehow just appreciated all that, sensed she had a subtler mind than his, but that he could please her, which made him happy. It was to his good credit that he looked beyond their physical differences to the heart of things human, which I admired, even if it wasn't in our mother to notice. Still, the odd union of their mismatched physical attributes always plays in my mind as part of the reason they ended up badly. They were, no doubt, simply wrong for each other and should never have married or done any of it, should have gone their separate ways after their first passionate encounter, no matter its outcome. The longer they stayed on, and the better they knew each other, the better she, at least, could see their mistake, and the more misguided their lives became, like a long proof in mathematics in which the first calculation is wrong, following which all other calculations move you further away from how things were when they made sense. A sociologist of those times, the beginning of the 60s, might say our parents were in the vanguard of an historical moment, were among the first who transgressed society's boundaries and embraced rebellion, believed in credos requiring ratification through self-destruction. But they weren't. They weren't reckless people in the vanguard of anything. They were, as I said, regular people, tricked by circumstance and bad instincts, along with bad luck, to venture outside of boundaries they knew to be right, and then found themselves unable to go back. Though I'll say this about my father. When he returned from the theater of war and from being the agent of whistling death out of the skies, it was 1945, the year my sister and I were born in Michigan at the Wurtsmith base in Oscoda, he may have been in the grip of some great unspecified gravity, as many GIs were. He spent the rest of his life wrestling with that gravity, puzzling to stay positive and to float, making bad decisions that truly seemed good for a moment, but ultimately misunderstanding the world he'd returned home to, and having that misunderstanding become his life. Again, it must have been that way for millions of boys, although he would never have known it about himself or admitted it was true. Done. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard, to offer us this great moment. Thank you very much.
Hot up there. Okay, let's try this again.
Yeah. If it doesn't work, I will speak in English. Is it okay?
I have the ear canals of a 4-year-old. Yes, yes I can.
Lucky boy.
Great.
5 ans que vous n'avez pas publié de livres. Qu'est-ce que vous avez fait pendant tout ce temps? Parce que Joyce Carol Oates, elle, chaque année, elle en publie un.
Nobody's talking to me. Oh, I've just been living my life. For me, and it's always been the case, life comes first and writing comes second. It's also the case that I'm slow about everything. I think slowly, I move slowly, I write slowly. And I think if I had to try to write more quickly, which I don't, I wouldn't do it nearly as well. Plus, I mean, the world doesn't need me to publish a book every 2 years if it's not going to be a good book. I mean, the world needs me to publish the best book I can possibly publish, and that takes as long as it takes. I mean, if I was John Grisham, it would be different. I mean, if an entire institution was resting upon my shoulders, it would be different. But as it is, this is how I do it.
Canada. Pourquoi ce titre Canada? Vous avez déclaré à Michel Schneider dans Le Point, « J'aime voir ce nom sur la page, Canada ». Il doit quand même y avoir d'autres raisons.
Well, there are a lot of other reasons. One was it was the first thing I thought. And it seemed like such a good idea, I just kept it. What I told Michel was that, you know, whatever the title to your book is, if you're me, you're going to see that word or that phrase on a lot of pages that are coming. So it ought to be something that you like to see. And for me, the word Canada, because it is a dactyl, it is the poetic foot that is a dactyl, which is to say, da-da-da, da-da-da, da-da-da. I like that noise. And I like the 3 vowel sounds, and I like the different consonantal sounds. And beyond those sort of poetical reasons, Canada has always been a place to me that made me feel good when I went there. And I've been to Canada a lot since I was 18, and every time I get to the border of Canada, I feel a kind of a frisson. I feel that I'm just about to enter a good place. Almost anywhere across the 49th parallel that I go, I get to Canada and I think, ooh, this is good. I remember very much the night after the terrible George Bush II was elected for the second time. I had to get a flu shot, and I couldn't get a flu shot in America, of course. I'm old enough now, but I wasn't old enough then. And so I went up to Canada to get a flu shot. And I remember crossing the border at a little town called Climax, Saskatchewan. And when I went across the border, I had this wonderful feeling of the world lifting off of me. I thought, well, now I'm someplace where George Bush is not the president. And that was such a feeling of elevation. I thought, you know, you don't get these kinds of feelings just every day. But when you do get such a feeling as that, you want to use it as a provocation for language.
Mais ça ne vous fait pas ça quand parce que vous auriez pu quitter George Bush par le sud. C'est uniquement le nord, la frontière du nord, qui vous fait breathe again for a good world, as you told me.
Well, you know, there's a line of Ralph Waldo Emerson's in his essay called Self-Reliance, in which he says, basically power ceases in moments of repose. Power accumulates and is accessible to you when you bridge a gap, when you go from something before to something after. You're probably right that this was the right border for me to cross, and it would have been a long way to go to get a flu shot to go to Mexico. But nonetheless, every time I cross a border, if it's the border from Germany to France, if it's the border irrespective, Northern Ireland to Southern, to the Republic.
Vous vous sentez libéré de George Bush?
No, but I feel that sense that something is behind me and something is ahead of me. And when it, you know, it's variously described as a commotion by Catherine Ann Porter, or it's described by Neruda as something kicking in his soul. I just feel something when I cross the border. And again, writers don't have these kinds of feelings all that often, so when you have one, you better pay attention to it.
Oui. Commotion Neruda, évocation de Pablo Neruda, je précise. Alors, ce livre est un roman sur la frontière, hein, je l'ai dit, la frontière qu'on traverse pour changer de vie, vous en avez parlé. C'est aussi un roman où un homme vieillissant se souvient de l'adolescent qu'il fut. L'adolescence n'est-elle pas, Richard Ford, la vraie frontière dans la vie d'un être humain?
Well, it's one of them. Certainly, it's one of them. The time when you venture out of adolescence in your mid-teens and you begin to take on some of the raiments of adulthood, that's certainly a large transition, and it qualifies as a border. I mean, I don't know if, as you are experiencing it, you see it as a border or not. I mean, to call these things border, Christophe, is a kind of a provisional overlay onto a life that is otherwise continuous and not defined by borders. So it was my optic in this, my lens in this way of describing this book and writing this book, to call this a border. But I mean, there are lots of borders. I mean, it's like the old notion of when people say, you know, you're having a midlife crisis. Well, you have a midlife crisis when you're 29, and then you have one when you're 41, and then you have one when you're 53, and you have one when you're 64. And so, but these things aren't really. These things aren't really demonstrable. I mean, you know, it's something Sartre says in this little essay called The Situation of the Writer in 1947. He says that it is for writers to give names to things, and in the process of giving names to things, to move something from an unreflected state to a reflected state, and thereby identify life in a way, and parts of life in a way, that causes us who are living it to see it more clearly, to live it more vividly, to maybe live it more prudently.
Il y a un écrivain que j'aime beaucoup, qui est un écrivain français, qui s'appelle Paul Nizan, qui a dit une chose très forte sur l'adolescence, et je me suis dit que Dale Parsons, le héros de votre livre, aurait peut-être pu les penser. Je voudrais vous les proposer. C'est un livre qui s'appelle Aden Arabi. J'avais 20 ans et je ne laisserai personne dire que c'est le plus bel âge de la vie. Tout menace de ruine un jeune homme. L'amour, les idées, la perte de sa famille, l'entrée parmi les grandes personnes. Il est dur d'apprendre sa partie dans le monde. Est-ce que Dale n'aurait pas pu dire ça aussi?
Well, I don't think you have to be French to think that. That may not be as profound as it seems. Well, I mean, I think that's seeing something from the point of view of eternity, really, that when you're sort of enmeshed in the daily to and fro of your life, you're probably just trying to keep your eyes on your toes and trying to see that your toes don't go in the wrong direction or have something bad happen to them. So, yes, I think that's true. Yes, I think that's true. But it is, I think, merely true.
Vous êtes un homme du Sud, hein, vous êtes né dans le Mississippi, mais vous vivez dans le Maine. Est-ce que le lieu où l'on vit change la perception de la vie? Parce que ça, c'est la première frontière que vous ayez traversée, Mississippi, pour venir vers le nord. Est-ce que le lieu est important?
Well, Location, I think, is as important as you let it be. I mean, for me particularly, I've lived, Christina and I have lived all over the country the whole time, the 45 years we've been married. And what I always think is, just give me a quiet place to be, where there aren't any kids running around, and where the TV's off, and I can pretty well function there. So, I mean, where I work in Maine, I work in a boathouse that has some tiny windows, but I block them off. I mean, the location for me regarding my work is the internal location that I'm thinking about. It's what's on the page. What's outside my room, you know, that would matter if I didn't like it, but insofar as I do like it. That then, however, is another matter about when I was young. I mean, I really very much needed to get out of Mississippi because the persona that I had developed for myself there and the one I was going to keep if I'd stayed in Mississippi was an unacceptable one. Some bad things were going to happen to me if I stayed.
Pourquoi?
Well, it was the racist time. It was a churchy, little bigoted state in a little unappealing town where I was on the wrong side of the race issues. You would say I was on the right side of the race issues, but I was on the wrong side of the race issues in Mississippi. So I could see that bad things were coming to me. Either I was going to get hurt, physically hurt, or I was going to succumb and become something much worse than hurt. I was going to succumb to something I didn't want to be. Because the social pressures were quite extreme and I wasn't a very strong boy. I wasn't a rebel by any means. I'm like the people I just described in my chapter. I mean, they weren't people on the forefront of anything, and neither was I. I just found myself thinking differently from how people were thinking around me, and when I figured that out, I thought, I have to get out of here. So that sense of location, that sense of unburdening yourself, that sense of shucking off from yourself certain things that you were just really born into, is a very different matter from going someplace and being a novelist someplace and working there inside a room.
Vous dites que vous avez dû quitter le Mississippi. Canada, c'est aussi un roman qui évoque une autre frontière, c'est la frontière entre la normalité, qui est la vie que mènent les parents avant le hold-up, et donc la frontière entre la normalité et la normalité, ce qui n'est pas anormal. Vous pensez que tout le monde est au bord de la vie criminelle, puisque vous-même avez été, à un moment, vous avez rêvé de gangster quand vous étiez jeune. Il paraît que vous avez même volé des voitures.
I say. I did steal a few cars when I was young.
Ouais.
It was really a lot of fun. I loved doing it. You know, again, this notion of there being a sort of a border between normality and abnormality, if you're living that existence, I don't know if you see that border quite so clearly as this novel would lead you to do.
Enfin, il y a la première voiture. La première voiture qu'on vole, on sait qu'on est passé de l'autre côté, non? Ça doit être tellement plaisant.
Yeah, but I didn't think that by stealing my first car that I had crossed a border. I thought I didn't think about a border at all. I just thought that life had suddenly expanded in a wonderful way. That things were really very much more possible than I had theretofore thought they were. But again, it's the novel's, this novel's provisional lens on the events that transpire, on the lives that are being described. But once you shut the book, and those lenses are closed inside, then that sense of border, maybe you carry it with you, maybe you don't, but that sense of border goes away. So it only lasts as a metaphor, so to speak, or as a lens for the duration of the book. And then you have to go back and live with your life, which again seems continuous and not full of borders. But I think that what the, you know, Eco says a wonderful thing. He says, he's talking about intellectuals, but he's kind enough to include novelists among intellectuals. He said that it's the intellectual's job in the world to address the world and say, pay attention, pay attention. And this provisional lens by which I describe borders, which you don't see in life, is my way of saying, pay attention.
Il y a une frontière que vous n'avez pas franchie, vous avez mentionné, cette frontière s'appelle Christina, c'est une femme avec laquelle vous vivez depuis 45 ans et à laquelle vous dédiez absolument tous vos livres. Voilà, tous vos livres. Et c'est pas To Christina, c'est juste le nom, Christina, sur l'adresse du livre, Christina, simplement, sans préposition. Pourquoi ce simple Christina?
Well, I guess I don't have a prepositional relationship with her.
Interesting. please continue. Interesting.
Well, it was just when I don't know if I decided to do that or if I just, like most of the things I do, just did it. It was probably something that represented a certain sort of profundity about my relationship with her and her relationship to the fact that she was an enthusiast for my trying to make a novelist out of myself at a time when there was no evidence that I could do that. I mean, I remember saying to her once, we were in Little Rock where my mother lived, and I had just left law school, and I just had not long before gotten out of the Marines, and I said to her, I said, I think I might try to be a writer. I could as easily said I might try to be a plumber, because there was, again, no...
Ou militaire.
Yeah, anything. And she said, oh, great. She said, what a good idea. She said, let's do that. And I'll get a job, and you stay home and write. And I was, at that time, 22 years old. I hadn't written or published or thought about writing anything. I just said that, and she thought it was good. And I think, in a way, she has given me the lenience to do this all of these 45 years. So it's not prepositional at all. It's not a compound, complex sentence. It's just a straight ahead subject, verb, object.
Comment comment est venue cette envie d'écrire? Parce que vous vouliez être militaire au départ.
I did. Well, you could say that being a novelist is kind of like being in the Marine Corps, in which you could tell everybody what to do all the time, and they have to do it.
Et on souffre aussi, et on est au combat permanent, jour après jour, comme les militaires. When you're right.
No, you're not going to get me to say that. I mean, if you hear any novelists telling you how hard they work, you should grab your wallet. I mean, if it was that hard, I wouldn't be doing it. Right? Not at age 69, I'll guarantee you that. The notion to be a writer came principally from being a reader. And what I found when I was 19 years old and I read Absalom, was that I had been going through life feeling a kind of a Peggy Lee syndrome, which was to say, is that all there is? Is that all there is to life? Because people were telling me life was great, and I wasn't noticing it. But when I read Absalom, what I felt was, through the agency of that book, another beat to life. And I just felt boom, like that. And what that other beat represented, and what language that I used to represent it to myself was, here was a big novel about life. And this big novel about life wanted to say, life is important enough for a book to be about. Life is important enough to be spoken to, so that you can bring back whatever the gist of the novel is into your life and make some use of it. And I think what I figured out was that I'd like to do that for somebody else. This was the 60s, and maybe people were more engaged in thinking of making their lives useful in the 60s than is true now. Maybe not. It's all a matter of individuals. But I wanted to make my life useful in some way. And it seemed, even as jejune as my impulse was, that I could maybe make myself useful doing that.
Donc on devient écrivain uniquement si on est lecteur d'abord, en tout cas pour vous c'est comme ça que ça s'est fait, et on devient écrivain pour être utile aux autres?
Well, I mean, that's a very personal decision. I mean, I think a lot of people decide to become writers for all kinds of different reasons. I mean, people decide to become writers because they want to express themselves. People decide to become writers because they think they might want to get rich. People decide to become writers, well, which foolishly. People decide to become writers for all kinds of reasons. Those are just those are just mine.
D'ailleurs, j'en profite parce que on vous a posé cette question. Quel conseil vous donneriez à un jeune écrivain? Et vous avez répondu d'arrêter tout de suite.
Yeah, sure. I mean, of course.
Ça m'a beaucoup choqué, Richard. Je tiens à vous le dire.
Well, look, okay? You're going to set off to be a writer. You're probably going to fail. And if you publish the books, probably no one's going to read them. You're probably going to feel bad a lot. You're going to be a bad husband. You're probably going to have a drinking problem. And so I say to myself, with that as a near certainty, try to talk yourself out of it. And then if you can't...
Mais même avec une Christina, si on a une Christina avec nous, on peut tout faire.
Well, sometimes my students at Columbia ask me, they say, what is the sort of sine qua non for being a writer? I say, well, you have to be married to Christina Ford. I say, but unfortunately, I already am. But I mean, if you can't talk yourself out of it, if you can't talk yourself out of it using this rationale, then maybe you think you could have a vocation. But I mean, I just think you have to look into these things rather grainily. Don't you?
Non, pas du tout. Je veux pas. C'est une des seules choses que je veux pas penser comme vous. On revient à Christina, on revient à la féminité, puisque vous avez, dans le très beau passage que vous avez lu, vous parlez des longs cils féminins de Bev Parsons et de son prénom Beverly, qui est un prénom de fille. Et vous dites, les hommes sont des feuilles balayées par le vent, alors que les femmes ont toujours été pour moi des figures plus substantielles, plus solides. Peut-être est-ce parce que j'ai trop traîné avec des écrivains. Car vous pouvez être sûr qu'un romancier est une créature plus ambiguë que les autres, mais moins ancrée dans la réalité concrète. C'est-à-dire qu'on revient à ça, pour être écrivain, vous parliez de lentille tout à l'heure, de façon de voir la vie, mais un écrivain, c'est forcément quelqu'un qui est désaxé par rapport à la réalité concrète.
It's always disturbing when you hear yourself quoted in translation. It just lets you know where those
Don't
words
believe
are
the
going
journalist.
out there. They just kind of make you up to suit their needs of that day. Let's just go on to the next question. I can't even begin to deal with that because it doesn't make any sense to me. I'm sure I didn't say it.
Alors là, pour le coup, vous ne pouvez pas me dire que vous ne l'avez pas lu. C'est votre première phrase du livre, que vous avez lu tout à l'heure. Comment est venue cette idée aussi absurde du hold-up? Parce que quand on nous présente les deux personnages et qu'on apprend que ces deux personnages-là, qui sont un mismatching couple, des gens qui vont vraiment pas ensemble, qui vont faire un hold-up, on n'y croit pas du tout. Donc, comment c'est venu? On sait tout de suite qu'ils vont se planter. L'idée du hold-up. D'abord, vous avez...
I got the idea because my first thought about this book was to have it be a book about a boy who, against his will, gets taken across the Canadian border. And I wrote that in 1988, and then I put those pages, 20 pages, into an envelope and put them away for 20 years. And over that 20 years, I thought to myself, well, what could cause a kid 16 years old to have to be transported against his will outside his parents' control? And I thought, well, something must have happened to his parents. And so I just sort of went through the possibilities of what could happen to his parents. Well, they could die. Well, I didn't want them to die. Well, they could get divorced. That wasn't interesting to me. And far down the line, I thought, well, hell, they could rob a bank. And when I thought, well, they could rob a bank, I thought, well, I want to write about that. I want to write about people who rob banks. You know, we talked before, there's a line of Randall Gerald's in which he said sometimes the writer is not the person who has the experience, but the person who needs to have it.
Ça, c'est génial.
Well, I maybe needed to have the experience of robbing a bank, but I could only do it by writing about it. So once I decided that they would rob a bank, then I just had to construct a kind of a rationale whereby people would rob a bank, and that became very interesting because people do rob banks. It's not as though it doesn't happen. It happens in America quite a lot.
Vous avez vu d'ailleurs la voiture criblée de balles quand vous étiez plus jeune de Bonnie and Clyde. Ça vous a marqué, ça? Ouais.
Well, it must have, because I stuck it in my book after about 50 years. It must have, yeah. We were in a little movie theater in Jackson, Mississippi, and somehow, you go in on Saturday morning at 8 o'clock, and you'd come out on Saturday afternoon at 5 o'clock. And when I walked out of this movie, somebody had pulled in this big flatbed truck, and on this flatbed truck was this ancient car all full of holes. And we had seen a movie about gangsters, of course, or 3 movies about gangsters. And the sign said, "Actual Bonnie and Clyde Death Car." And it was long before I wrote things down, but I did remember it, and I just realized when I was writing this book, I had some use for that, you know, many decades later. Yeah. So then I just had to invent the rationale for why 2 people would rob a bank. And it's not as hard as you think, Christophe, to construct a rationale for why people would rob banks, if you just will concede that they do.
Je vais vous poser une dernière question. On aimerait rester avec vous plus longtemps, évidemment. La dernière frontière, certaines personnes disent que la littérature, aujourd'hui, c'est terminé, qu'elle est en train de passer la frontière, je vais prendre l'image antique de l'Achéron, le fleuve des morts. Elle est en train de passer du côté des vivants au côté des morts. Quel est votre sentiment sur la littérature à l'âge du numérique? On dit que les gens écrivent de plus en plus... Sorry.
That's okay, I got it.
Okay.
I got it. I understood it anyway.
What do you think about people saying that literature now is a dead thing? That people, of course, they write, but they write SMS, short message.
I don't think anything about that. I mean, there's a hunger for literature in the world that will simply have an answer that will be provided for. I mean, the delivery system for literature is going to change. Maybe these things we now call books will just become antiquarians' business. But the impulse to believe that you can go to a book and get something that you need, I don't think that's going away. And it's not just because I'm the age I am. I mean, I teach in a program where there are young writers coming into our midst all the time. And what we try to do is entertain their best efforts, encourage them to be as good as they can be. They seem, as far as I can tell, smarter than I was, more acutely aware of themselves than I was when I started. So I'm really not worried about that. It's not because just that they want to do it. It's also because there's an appetite for it in the world.
You just told, it's contradictory, you just told us that you want to encourage these young writers.
Yeah, well,
and you told before that, no, you want to be a writer, it's too bad, too difficult.
When I intercept
just to test them, you want to test them.
When I intercept these young women and men, they have gone by that already. They've already put themselves through that kind of scrutiny, and they're there because they want to give it a shot. I wouldn't discourage them, those people. I mean, no. But you asked me kind of generalized question, what do I think about it? And that's what I think about it. Because by golly, that's what I did.
Do you now still write about your father?
Well,
because you wrote a book on your mother?
I'd like to write an essay about my father, but I'm getting so damn old. And
but you announced
his life is getting farther and farther away from me, and as years go by, once again though I've got a big envelope, just like I had for Canada. I've got a big envelope with about 600 notes that I have kept over the last, say, 30 years, for what I could actually put together and make a memoir. So I'd like to do that. Something, just as was the case with Canada, something has prevented me from sitting down and doing that. And usually when that happens, it means that I don't think I'm capable of doing it at that point. So that's probably why I haven't done it. But I keep on wanting to do it, and I keep on making these notes. And so I think a time will come when I'll do it. I mean, it's very much an essay about a father who was absent. And that has so far been complicated enough that I haven't felt confident to start on it. But I'm thinking about it, and in fact, to think about things like that is immensely pleasurable.
Thank you very much, Richard Ford. Merci à vous. Merci d'applaudir Richard Ford. Et je crois que vous allez signer votre livre. Non, there is signature.
Je sais.
We don't know. OK.
Si c'est possible, oui.
Voilà. Perfect. Thank you very much.